Welcome, class! Today's explainer is incredibly special. I'm your professor for the day, and we're diving into the absolute ultimate exam review guide. We're talking about applying Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's postcolonial theories directly to literary analysis. If you're gearing up for your final papers or exams, you are in the exact right place. We're going to take some really high-level theory and transform it into highly practical tools you can use right away. Okay, let's take a quick look at the professor's blueprint. We've got 5 key areas to hit today. First, defining Spivak subalternity. Second, analyzing narrative mediation. Third, deciphering meaningful silence. Fourth, intersectional marginalization and power. And finally, the analytical toolkit. All right, part 1, defining Spivak's subalternity. So, I want to kick things off with a real Socratic question for you all. Does visible poverty automatically mean a character is a subaltern? Think about it. If you come across a poor laborer in a novel, do you just automatically label them as subaltern in your essays? Take a second to really mull that over. Well, the answer is no, and this is absolutely crucial to get right for your exams. A subaltern is defined by structural exclusion from systems of power and representation, not merely by social or economic disadvantage. Their voice is literally blocked from entering the dominant discourse. Even if they do physically speak, their words might not be recognized as meaningful. Because remember, literature, it's never neutral, my friends. Every single story has a narrator picking and choosing what to include and what to leave out. The author essentially plays God, and honestly, they can be quite the tyrant. To really picture this, let's look at 2 character case studies: the revolutionary leader versus the background peasant. Now, the revolutionary leader might be totally destitute, economically speaking, but if the narrative gives them agency, if we hear their inner thoughts, and their public speeches actually change the story's events, they aren't structurally voiceless. Contrast that with a background peasant. They might show up in every single chapter, but they never speak directly, and their inner life is completely locked away from us. They don't make choices, they're just used as a symbol or a prop. That right there, that is structural silence. Moving right along to part 2, analyzing narrative mediation. Here we really start to see how power shapes empathy. Notice the stark contrast between elite narrators and marginalized narrators. Elite narrators tend to filter a subaltern character's identity entirely through a dominant lens. If a novel about colonized people is narrated by a colonial official, the whole story basically shapes reader empathy toward that elite perspective. It reinforces the dominant power structure. But marginalized narrators, they actually challenge those dominant structures and assumptions. They offer a much more authentic reflection. But, and this is a big but, Spivak warns us that all literature is a constructed space. Even the most sympathetic mediation is still, at the end of the day, mediation. Now write this down because you absolutely must remember these 3 ways dominant perspectives can accidentally suppress subaltern voices. First up, romanticization and stereotyping. That's reducing complex, messy human beings to mere symbols of victimhood or noble tradition. It strips away all their individuality. Second, speaking for them or filtering. That's when a narrator claims to completely understand a character's inner truth without actually letting them speak for themselves. And third, epistemic violence, dismissing their knowledge entirely in favor of the dominant interpretation. Let's unpack that last one a bit because epistemic violence is a massive, massive concept. It occurs when marginalized groups are defined, categorized, or interpreted in ways that completely distort their reality. It literally causes their own knowledge systems to disappear from history. Imagine a colonial court scene where a rural woman's perfectly valid testimony is entirely dismissed simply because the legal system considers her uneducated. They reinterpret her whole experience and deny her truth. Her knowledge vanishes. That is epistemic violence. Okay, let's jump into part 3, deciphering meaningful silence. When analyzing text, you've got to watch out for these 2 distinct forms of silence. First, literal silence. Think of a domestic worker in a story who observes absolutely everything going on, but the narrative never gives her a single line of dialogue to express her inner thoughts. Then you have symbolic silence. This is like a rural woman who actually speaks out loud against injustice, but her protests are completely and utterly ignored by her community. In the first case, she's denied subjectivity. In the second, she speaks, but the system refuses to acknowledge her speech as meaningful. Both of these are deeply structural. Now, as advanced students, you have to be able to tell the difference between meaningful silence and simple narrative neglect. Meaningful silence is an intentional critique by the author. They're purposefully leaving gaps to show oppression, forcing us, the readers, to confront that absence head-on. Narrative neglect, on the other hand, is just an accidental structural blind spot. It's when marginalized voices are simply ignored by the text without any critical purpose. Imagine a novel about a massive political upheaval that only ever follows the elite leaders. The working class barely exists in the story at all. That's narrative neglect. It's the literary equivalent of throwing a huge party and literally forgetting to invite half the guests. Which brings us to part 4, intersectional marginalization and power.
If you want to ace your essays, use these exact exam prompts to identify intersectional marginalization. Ask yourself, how do colonial history and patriarchy overlap to double silence this specific character? Are female subaltern characters denied a public voice out in the world, while at the exact same time being expected to blindly obey at home? And critically, does the narrative present this gendered silencing as completely natural, or does it actively challenge it? Spivak makes it abundantly clear. The subaltern woman is often doubly silenced, caught between colonial inequality and familial patriarchy.
And here is the real secret to a high-scoring essay: differentiating between authentic character agency and performative representation. Authentic character agency means the subaltern character defines themselves. They make real choices that express disagreement, they negotiate their own survival. Performative representation? That's when the subaltern is celebrated, sure, but they're heavily mediated. They're basically reduced to a simplified tool for expressing the author's larger political themes, with zero true autonomy. Remember, mere celebration does not equal agency. Look for the messy choices, the negotiations, the resistance. All right, the home stretch, part 5, the analytical toolkit. I highly recommend you memorize these 5 key steps for textual analysis. 1. Examine the social hierarchy within the story itself. 2. Analyze narrative voice and authority. 3. Look out for mediation and filtering. 4. Actively observe gaps, contradictions, and absences. And 5. Consider the intersections of gender, class, caste, and race. Walking through this exact checklist will instantly elevate your work. You'll move from basic, surface-level character summaries to a really deep, structural critique of how power actually operates within the storytelling. So, how do we put this all together into a critical essay? Well, first, identify who actually holds narrative authority and who is being filtered through intermediaries. Next, assess the power dynamics regarding voice: who speaks, who actually listens, and whose speech changes the plot. Seriously, count who interrupts who in dialogue. It's incredibly revealing about patriarchal hierarchy. Then, look for those gaps and contradictions between what the text claims to be saying and how it actually treats subalterns. Differentiate between that authentic agency and performative representation we just talked about. And finally, conclude by doing exactly what Spivak demands. Reflect on the ethical limits of representation and acknowledge your own position as a reader.
Because as we are brilliantly reminded here, ethical reading absolutely demands examining knowledge construction and its limits. Literature always operates within structures of power. We can't just casually assume we're neutral observers recovering some pure subaltern voice. We're engaging with a highly constructed space, and our understanding of it is always going to be partial.
I want us to really reflect on this defining quote from the lecture. Ethical criticism requires attention to structure, not just sympathy for suffering. It is so easy to just feel bad for a marginalized character, isn't it? But it takes genuine, rigorous academic effort to actually analyze the narrative framework that forced them into that position of powerlessness in the first place. So, I leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on as you prep for your exams. What are your own assumptions as a reader, and how do they shape the way you interpret marginalized voices? Your background, your education, your cultural position, all of it completely influences how you read silence and voice. Take that deep self-awareness into your exams, rely on this toolkit, and you're going to analyze these texts at a completely new level. Thanks so much for joining me for today's explainer class. Best of luck on those finals.